With themed classes, what I mean is you can pick a certain element and you can make your playlist reflect that element. So you can pick earth, right? You can pick earth because I do a lot of first chakra classes because grounding is so important. And if you're teaching in a new place with new students, the first thing that they want to do is feel grounded and feel safe. And there's a lot of chaos in today's world and financial instability and all kinds of things that make people feel unstable in their lives. So doing classes to promote grounding, which is a first chakra thing, that is something that I do very, very, very often. More often, I would say, than just crown chakra, like spirituality, let's go to outer space, although that is fun sometimes. And sometimes I do that. But more often than I'm then taking people to outer space, I'm grounding people and making them feel their foundation and feel connected to the earth, because I feel like that's more needed and more important, at least where I live in the world. So with that kind of more grounding element that I'm bringing into classes, we'll often do an earthy type of playlist. And what I mean by that is more of that percussion beats, low beats, earthy sounds, earthy tones, and earthy textures to music. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Coffee Witching Hour. This is my podcast that is all about yoga, birth, and raising kind humans. And today we are going to be talking about something that I am so passionate about and so excited to share. I'm going to be talking to you about how I make my yoga playlists. Now, this is one of the most common questions that I get from my students is, what music is on your playlist and what song was that? And just different questions about the music that I choose for my yoga classes, and not necessarily about playlisting in general, but I feel like it's all woven into there. And I feel like some of the songs, people wouldn't even notice if they were just listening to music on their own. It's kind of bringing them into an experience and allowing the music to facilitate that experience and to enhance that experience. And so this is a really great one to listen to if you are a yoga teacher who makes your own playlists and struggles with them, because I hear so often that yoga teachers spend hours and hours and hours on just making a single playlist, and sometimes that playlist falls flat, and then what do you do? So this is a really great episode to listen to if you are struggling with that, as so many yoga teachers do. Because it's one of my favorite things to do, and I kind of feel like I've got it into a really quick system where I can kind of just whip off a yoga playlist in a couple of minutes. Maybe that's an exaggeration. It's a little more than a couple of minutes, but it's something that I do passively so that the final process of actually working on a playlist is literally just a couple of minutes. So if you are curious about how to make a phenomenal yoga playlist, then this is the episode for you. Let's dive straight in. Okay, so first I want to start with just a little bit about my framework for making yoga playlists and how I learned to make yoga playlists, because it's not always intuitive. So I was teaching for about maybe 2 years, a year and a half, definitely not for very long before I did my hip hop yoga training. What is hip hop yoga? Okay, that's a great question. Hip hop yoga is just yoga to a hip hop playlist. Basically, that's the easiest way to explain it. Is it real yoga? Yes. Bottom line, yes. That's a discussion that we can get into in another podcast. What is yoga? What is not yoga? Is goat yoga yoga? Is beer yoga yoga? What is yoga? That's a really great question. But that can be a conversation that we get into in another podcast. Just the bottom line is to say that hip hop yoga is real yoga. And I won't argue more about that. But it's yoga to a hip hop playlist. So that is something that was really popular on the East Coast when I first started teaching. So I started teaching in Boston. That was where I was practicing hip hop yoga, and a hip hop yoga training popped up and I went for it and did not regret it, because the biggest thing that I learned from it was how to create a playlist that's really in sync with your class. So really, essentially what you're doing is you're DJing. You're making the playlist fit to the energy of the students. You're making your playlist fit to the sequence that you're teaching, and it's just fitting to the mood that you want to create, the vibe that you want to create. It's fitting to the class. So I took that training, I learned the art of playlisting, and immediately I changed the way that I did playlisting, because before that point, I think I just wasn't using much of a structure at all. I was just throwing some yoga music into a playlist and kind of arranging it a little bit, maybe not much, and just throwing it out there to the class. And I feel like sometimes that really fell short. And then once I used this new system, it just felt like it was almost fail-proof. As soon as I started using this new system that I learned in hip hop yoga, it just took my classes to a completely different level. And I'll get into that system as we go on, but that's just to say that it really, really does work. And the techniques they taught were extremely simple. And if you're a music lover, you probably already create playlists anyways and collect music into playlists anyways. And it's just taking it up another notch and putting it into a sequence that makes sense for your yoga class. So I took that training and started implementing that way of playlisting, and then have had years of experience since then of playlisting, of teaching yoga classes to music that is sequenced in this way, and have kind of finessed it and taken risks, taught classes where the playlist went over perfectly, and felt like in a lot of ways the playlist was kind of the centerpiece of the class. It's that element in the background that maybe no one even notices really, but it's what is setting the tone to the entire class, and it really, really, really does make a difference. And then I have had classes where I've had songs come up and I kind of cringe because there's just a feeling in the room that, oh, okay, maybe that song is not right for the energy. And you kind of start to notice that in the room, and you notice the sideways glances, and you notice the subtle looks and the changes in movement, people looking up from child's pose and being like, what is this? Maybe it's more subtle than that. Maybe it's just an energetic feeling, but you kind of start to notice what is falling short with students. And that really, really depends studio to studio, student to student, whatever your audience may be, it kind of can vary. But so I've taken a lot of risks, and I've learned from those risks what works generally for a general yoga audience, what doesn't work, and now I'm presenting it to you here. So the first thing that you want to know about yoga playlisting is that you want your yoga playlist to follow the same energetic arc that your class is taking. So when I learned to teach yoga, I learned Vinyasa yoga in my yoga teacher training. And with that system, there was always a peak in the center, and then it goes back down. The energy goes back down. So it's this process of centering, warming up, moving through a flow, peaking at a certain pose. So that might be it could be any peak, but sometimes it's crow pose or dancer pose or whatever it may be. And then everything else is kind of winding down, flowing down, longer held stretches, and then Shavasana. So it's this peak in the middle and then back down. So what I learned was to sequence in accordance with that peak, but it's a little bit subtle. So you don't necessarily put the most energetic songs in the very middle. Sometimes the peak is a little bit farther out in the class. Usually, actually, the peak, if you're teaching Vinyasa yoga, is a little bit farther out in the class. So you kind of want to rev up to that peak and then slowly move back down. So it's not really a center peak, but more of a peak towards the 3/4 mark and then revving back down. But I don't usually teach Vinyasa yoga anymore. That's not really what I teach most frequently. Most of the time I'm teaching Flow and Restore or prenatal yoga or Baby and Me classes. And those have very different peaks and very different sequences. And so I've kind of learned the art of yoga playlisting, but I've adapted it to those formats. So when I first started making yoga playlists, I made a playlist every single week and really followed that format that I learned in hip hop yoga very, very closely, and just spent a long time really kind of finessing the playlist and making sure it was just right, being a perfectionist about things. And then, I probably did that until the pandemic hit, to be honest. And then I kind of, realized that I'm not getting paid to create playlists. Playlisting is fun, but this is not what I'm here for as a yoga teacher. I'm here to teach yoga, not to make playlists. So I kind of realized farther into teaching, before the pandemic probably, but farther into teaching, that I probably needed to tone it down a little bit with a playlist. But I did continue making those almost weekly playlists until the pandemic. And then after that, when, I had that long break during the pandemic to reflect and move things onto video and change things up. Once I came out of that pandemic state and started teaching in person again in St. Louis, I was not going to make a playlist every single week, because after a lot of reflection and realizing that that's not my job, playlisting is not my job, it's fun, but it's not my job, I could definitely get away with just one yoga playlist a month. Of course, I could go back to those older playlists, and I did sometimes, but every time I went back to an older playlist, there was something that I wanted to change. So rather than go through the nitty-gritty process of changing those details in those old playlists, which was going to be really time consuming, what I usually have been doing is just completely creating a new playlist. It's quicker, trust me, it's quicker. And just doing that once a month. And I use the same playlist for all of my classes, mostly. So I use the same playlist for Flow and Restore, for prenatal, for baby and me. But I will kind of DJ it differently, if that makes sense. I do have one dedicated playlist for baby and me because it's kind of a very different vibe to other classes. But even then, I find I only want to play that about once a month, and then I'll switch it to a different yoga playlist, to the regular one that I'm making every month, because Baby and Me yoga class is for the babies, but it's mostly for the moms. So I'm kind of weaving in that music that I would teach to a prenatal or Flow and Restore or other adult-centered class, more than just catering to the babies. So that's kind of how frequently I create playlists, but how do I do it? Okay, that's the key question. So what I do is I just listen to a lot of music during the month. I listen to often my Discover Weekly on Spotify, and Spotify thinks that my favorite genre is yoga music, and that's not inaccurate. I think my favorite artist is Trevor Hall, who is very much a yoga musician, but my Discover Weekly is mostly 100% yoga music. So from there, I pick out what I like, I put it into a playlist for the next month. So I'm funneling things into my April yoga playlist right now. And then when it comes time to teach in April, I'll take a few minutes, arrange the songs into order, maybe add a few songs from suggested, or I might have some songs in mind that I'll search and put into a playlist. I might draw from older playlists because I have probably hundreds of yoga playlists at this point that I can draw from. Funnel it into a playlist, just arrange it, and then I'm done. So it takes me literally a couple of minutes of work to make a new playlist, and then it's good for an entire month. After a month, it's not that the students are complaining, but I'm ready to create a new playlist. Like, I've created enough of a base from the previous month just listening to music that I'm ready to create a new playlist and want to create a new playlist, and don't feel like it's going to be a lot of effort to create a new playlist. So I usually do it about once a month, and it's usually a very quick process, and it's something that I really enjoy doing. So I've really cut down the amount of time that it takes to make a playlist from when I first started playlisting, which was literally probably spending hours just looking for music and putting music into that playlist and arranging and things. Now it's very, very, very quick. So the other key that I've learned is that when I say you want to match the music to the energy of your class, what I mean is that you want to make sure that the BPM, the beats per minute, peaks when you want it to peak. So it's quickest in the middle of the class and then goes back down, more or less. That's kind of, there are always exceptions to rules, but more or less that's the rule that you want to follow with yoga playlisting. There is an app that they taught they provided us in our hip hop yoga training. I think it's just called BPM. I'll link to it in the show notes or in the description, but that was really, really, really helpful to me when I first started playlisting. You put it in, you put your song on, and then you just tap, tap, tap every time you hear the beat. And it tells you what the BPM is. And so you can kind of compare the different songs on your playlist. And if you are being exact about things, you can put that song exactly where it needs to go, between the lower BPM and the higher BPM if you're putting it at the beginning, or between the higher and the lower if you're putting it towards the end. So you want to follow that wave of the class. Now, I've adapted my classes because I teach more flow and restore and even prenatal. I've adapted it so that my peak of the class is in the right spot. So with flow and restore, that would be midway through the class, right in the middle. With vinyasa, I said the peak would be a little after the middle of the class, about closer to the 3/4 mark. With prenatal, it's also about midway through the class. Yeah, it's about midway through the class that it peaks. And the thing is that flow and restore and prenatal, the two that I teach weekly, in addition to Baby and Me, those two classes are different lengths. So flow and restore is an hour and prenatal is 90 minutes. And I'm using the same playlist even though the peak is going to be at different points. So with flow and restore, as I said, the peak is going to be at about 30 minutes in because it's in the middle. With prenatal, the peak is going to be at 45 minutes in. So it's also about in the middle of the class because there's a longer wind down portion in prenatal as well, is what I usually tend to teach. So how do I do that? How do I use the same playlist when the peak is a little bit different during those two classes? Well, with prenatal, there's a longer introduction and there's a longer check-in and a longer portion of class that I don't play music. So usually it can take, honestly, anywhere up to, usually about 15 to almost 20 minutes sometimes to get through the check-in and the icebreaker. And it's really a way to build community among prenatal students. We do that in Baby and Me also, where we're doing more talking and we're doing more of that community building at the beginning. So class doesn't actually start, or the playlist doesn't actually start until about 15 minutes in. So if you're doing the math, 15 minutes in, 30 minutes, and then you're at your peak. So it's the same peak as flow and restore. So I can use literally the exact same playlist. I just have a longer end portion. So the flow and restore doesn't hear all of the playlist, or sometimes I'll jump in at the point that I want to. So this is where the DJing comes in. So once I know with the flow and restore class, we've hit our peak and we're going to wind into restorative music, usually I'll turn down the music slowly. You never want to just completely stop a song you're DJing, remember. So fade out the music, pause. They'll be in child's pose or another resting posture. Take a big breath in and out. And then rev up the music again at the point in the playlist that I'm ready to rev them up. So that would be more towards the restorative portion of class. That's where I'm positioning the playlist. And then it seamlessly flows into those restorative songs. And I'm kind of doing the same with my prenatal clients as well, with the prenatal yoga class. But sometimes I may not fade out the playlist because it'll go straight into those more restorative songs at the point in class when I'm ready for those restorative songs. But that fading out, taking a breath in silence and fading in where I want the playlist, that is a key that I use a lot during my yoga classes. So I'll use that when I'm ready to wind down into the restorative songs often, or if I find that a song is falling flat for whatever reason. It could be people, vibes in the room, looks in the room, or it can be something inside. Like I'm hearing the song and I'm like, this isn't right. So I'll turn down the music, fade it out, take that breath together, and then fade back into a song that feels more right for that moment. That's a key. That's something that I do a lot during my yoga classes if I notice there's kind of a mistake in the playlist. The other time when I use that trick is in flow and restore classes. I do a lot of sun salutations. Sometimes I do sun salutations where I lead the first few and then I tell them to do the last few together or rest if they want. So I'll allow them to do about 2 or 3 rounds of sun salutations on their own, usually moving to a song. I'll stop talking, turn up the volume on the music a little bit, let them flow, and then once they're all in child's pose, once they finish those sun salutations, I'll let the music flow a little bit, take a breath in and out, fade down the music, take another breath in silence and out. And then jump back into the playlist, maybe at the next song, or maybe I'll skip a song depending on where I want to put them in the playlist. So it's a lot of DJing that I'm doing during the class. So that's why I can use one playlist for basically all of my classes, whether it's prenatal or flow and restore, or if I'm subbing a different yoga class, a vinyasa or whatever it may be. Baby and Me is a little bit different. As I said, there's not really a peak during the yoga class. It kind of is more ebbs and flows depending on baby's energy and what's going on in the room. So that's a little bit more variable. So like I said, I just have one kind of dedicated Baby and Me playlist, or I'll play something else, but I'll kind of have the volume of the music be a little bit lower and won't really worry about the music too much except for Shavasana. And then I like to play one specific Shavasana song often during Baby and Me. It's a song that just goes shh, so it's kind of like white noise in the background. So that's something that I do often in Baby and Me. So the playlist is there and it's a part of the yoga class, but it's not quite as important as with my other yoga classes that I teach, where I feel like music really is setting the tone for those classes. So that's a little bit about how I make the playlist. I'm following the BPM. I usually don't have to look at the BPM anymore. Now I kind of just hear it in my head and I'm like, oh, that will go here, that will go here, that will go here. But if I'm ever in doubt, I haven't done this recently at all, but if I'm in doubt, I would just use the BPM app and tap it out, look at what the BPM is, and put the song into the playlist at whatever point it needs to be. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, because if you follow the BPM to an exact science, some songs are gonna have more slow and soft elements, whereas other songs are going to have more high energy elements. So you can't really follow that rule to a T, but it's a nice guideline, and then you can adjust and finesse as needed. So the other thing that's really, really fun that I like to do with yoga playlisting is do themed classes. And this isn't like a themed class like, you know, with hip hop yoga, there used to be a lot of artist versus another artist, which used to be fun. So it would be like Drake versus Frank Ocean. I think I did a class with that theme, or like whatever. So, you know, you could have themed artist playlists, like a Beyonce themed playlist or whatever it may be. I don't teach hip hop yoga anymore, so I'm not going to play a playlist full of Drake. Although when I did start teaching in Boston with even my normal yoga classes, I would have a lot of Drake on playlists. And, you know, I did get some comments. Drake is not an appropriate artist for yoga classes. But back then in Boston, you know, it was kind of a younger crowd going to yoga classes, and most of the time it was fine in most of the studios. So now at this stage in my life, teaching where I am and teaching the clients that I do, I would not put Drake on a yoga playlist. I just wouldn't, or any other kind of like more hip hop artist, just because I know the feel of the studios that I'm at now, and that probably wouldn't go down super well. But where I was teaching in Boston, completely fine. Some of those classes where the studios that had hip hop yoga in those studios, or even like there was a class that I taught that was just called Prana to Music, very vague. It just said a yoga class set to a modern day contemporary playlist. So there's a lot of freedom there to play whatever you want essentially, but there was a lot of kind of more hip hop elements to it. So those studios, that kind of thing was entirely appropriate. There were other studios that I taught at Boston where, you know, I was basically told no to those playlists, you know, just teach in silence or instrumental, but no hip hop, nothing modern. And that was the vibe of those studios, and I adapted to that. And as I said, in St. Louis, the studios I teach at are not hip hop yoga studios at all. So it's really only yoga music that I play during yoga classes. Yoga music as in kind of more high vibe, I think is what it's technically called. Yeah, more of the Trevor Hall type of Boulder feel. Spotify says that my musical taste fits best into Boulder, and yeah, I guess that's kind of the yoga music that I'm talking about. So that's what I mostly play during yoga classes now. But with themed classes, what I mean is you can pick a certain element and you can make your playlist reflect that element. So you can pick earth, right? You can pick earth because I do a lot of first chakra classes because grounding is so important. And if you're teaching in a new place with new students, the first thing that they want to do is feel grounded and feel safe. And there's a lot of chaos in today's world and financial instability and all kinds of things that make people feel unstable in their lives. So doing classes to promote grounding, which is a first chakra thing, that is something that I do very, very, very often. More often, I would say, than just crown chakra, like spirituality, let's go to outer space, although that is fun sometimes. And sometimes I do that. But more often than taking people to outer space, I'm grounding people and making them feel their foundation and feel connected to the earth, because I feel like that's more needed and more important, at least where I live in the world. So with that kind of more grounding element that I'm bringing into classes, we'll often do an earthy type of playlist. And what I mean by that is kind of more percussion, more earthy sounds, more, I don't know how to even describe it without just putting a playlist up there, which I can, but more of that percussion beats, low beats, earthy sounds, earthy tones, and earthy textures to music. If I want to do the opposite end of the spectrum, a class that's just taking people to outer space, which, as I said, is really fun to do sometimes, maybe closer towards the end of class, I would pick more ethereal elements to the playlist, more of sounds of like the cosmos and more of, sounds of like floating in outer space among the stars, kind of. And I think if you listen to high vibe music, you'll kind of notice or know the differentiation between those more spacey songs and the more earthy songs. So being able to pull from those different elements in your playlist, like creating a whole playlist that's just earth, or creating a whole playlist that's just space, or anything in between. Like if you want to create a heart-centered playlist, something that's just like, string music and love and all of that, that can be good when the mood is right for that. So if it's like a Valentine's Day kind of themed class, that can be really fun. Although even then, I feel like it can be kind of cheesy sometimes if you're off about it. Like I wouldn't just play a slow R&B romantic class. I think I did that one time and it was really cringy when I was teaching hip-hop yoga on Valentine's Day. I think I had a playlist like that and it was like not the best, I think. Not the best for the mood. But what I mean by that is just a more heart-centered playlist. Sometimes what I like to do is music in foreign languages, like music with a lot of heart and soul and lyrics in it in foreign languages, a lot of Spanish-speaking languages. I'll put that into a playlist, a yoga playlist, and that can be a really nice heart-opening kind of sequence that's more subtle than just sappy R&B. If I want to do a playlist that's more water element, you can bring in sounds of the water, you can bring in ocean sounds, have some more of that nature music. There are a lot of songs with just the elements in the title, so even going with songs that just say water in the title, and then doing a more like hip opening kind of class. Or if I want to do something that's more throat chakra, having music with like wind chimes and sounds of wind moving through trees, leaning on that wind element a little bit more to do a throat chakra class. So you can play with all of those different elements and still use that peak sequencing tool or follow whatever peak you may have in your class. So usually it'll be towards the middle or the 3/4 mark, or if you do teach just a static class, which I don't think many people do, then just kind of having consistency during that class, but really tailoring that peak to whatever energy you want in the class. So if you teach, this is a good point, because I do teach some restorative workshops or sub for restorative classes. If I'm teaching restorative classes, there is no peak for restorative classes. It's just all low energy, or yin classes too, all slow restorative music. And there's no real peak for that. It's just following a slow, consistent kind of playlist the entire time. And that's where you can really draw on those different elements. You can have an entire heart-centered restorative playlist, or an entire earthy restorative, or an outer space restorative class. So that's where playlisting becomes really important there too. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about with playlisting is the use of silence. And I did already mention this with in the check-in in the beginning, there's usually silence, time for centering. If I do a meditation at the beginning, it's often in silence, and then I'll put on the playlist during cats and cows, often during class. And then with the fading in, fading out, I use that beat of silence as a way of recentering. But silence is also really, really important, can be during Shavasana. And I know there are really mixed opinions on the use of silence during Shavasana. Some teachers are very, very adamant about Shavasana needing to be in complete silence, because it may be the only time during the day that people have that quiet, stillness, doing nothing at all. And I think that can be really important sometimes, depending on who the student is. But what I find more often is that silence can be really triggering to people for that reason, because people are very rarely in complete silence these days. So it can feel very jarring to take someone from their busy day-to-day life into a completely silent room, and can feel honestly like traumatizing to people. Like, it can bring up a lot to just put them into a silent meditation, or to just fade them into complete silence at the end of class. So because I see that very often, people getting agitated during silence, I usually kind of will ease them into it a little bit more. So having slow music, I often like to play, it's called Chords of the Cosmos, but it's just a tone, a frequency that's in harmony. It's like 3 notes in harmony, and it's just that during Shavasana. And I feel I've gotten a lot of comments on how calming that can be, because it's not silence, but it almost seems like silence. And then I'll often, sometimes, depending if I have enough time, fade it out to complete silence and let students rest in silence for a little bit, but I don't just throw them into silence. I don't like being thrown into silence, me personally. And I know other people, like I said, get agitated when that happens. So easing them into silence. Or sometimes people just don't like silence altogether. Like, it's too much for them today and in that moment. So I'll just leave the slow music on and fade out through that. And then not have that element of silence. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that's the edge that people are at. And I kind of will assess based on who's showing up to class. Now, the other thing is that as yoga teachers, it's also very important to know how to teach without music, because a lot of times, like especially if you're going to, an event or a corporate class or whatever it may be, you may have to teach in silence. That just may be the protocol. And some studios, they encourage teaching in silence over having music. So there can be something powerful about having a class that's completely in silence. And that's something that I prefer personally to teach with music, because as I've said this entire time, I love teaching with music and it creates such a vibe. But I also know how to teach in silence too, and I will do that if needed. Sound machines also, so even if you do have to teach in silence, you can have a sound machine in the background, and that can be very calming, just kind of some white noise. But teaching in complete silence is also a skill, even without a sound machine, without whatever background noise, but complete silence, just the ambient noise in the background, whatever it may be. That is another skill that is necessary to cultivate as yoga teachers, to be versatile, to be adaptable. So that was a deep dive into how I playlist and how I use music during my yoga classes and how I DJ during my yoga classes and all of that. Yeah, this is something that I'm really, really passionate about. If I miss something, or if there's a different way that you like to use music in yoga classes, or if you don't like to use music in yoga classes, or if you like to playlist or hate playlisting, or have tips or tricks that I didn't mention, or artists that you love to include in playlists, please do comment, let me know, and we can weave all of that information into further podcasts, because I feel like this is level one. There's so much more now that I'm talking about it. There's so much deeper that we can go into the art of using music and DJing during yoga classes. Yeah, I don't feel like most yoga teachers call themselves DJs, but that's what we're doing. We're creating that vibe. So let me know if there's something that I missed, or there's something that you would like to throw out there as well. If there are topics that you would like to hear, please let me know. If you're in St. Louis, I have a workshop coming up really soon. It's not a yoga music workshop, but there will be music there. And there's going to be chocolate too and self-massage. It's a mindful chocolate tasting and self-massage workshop that's 2 hours long at Urban Breath. That's happening in April. So I will link in the show notes or description to that workshop as well. Yeah, I hope to see you there if you're in St. Louis. Otherwise, like, comment, subscribe, support on Patreon, do all those things, and I'll see you next time.